Dr. Craig Just. Craig's been at the University of Iowa since 1993, is that right? I'm wearing my glasses, I can't actually see this. He said I should tell you that he always beats me at golf. That's how we know each other, but that would be untrue. Craig's an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and a research scientist at the Hydrology Institute. It's got a long technical name that I can't ever remember. And one of the most popular professors on campus, in my opinion. So we always ask him to do things like this. So having said that, I'm turning it over to him.
Thank you. Yes, oh yeah. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to I teach our Introduction to Sustainability class on campus, and one of the things we teach in that class is the art of democratic dialoguing. And whenever we democratically dialogue, we always name and frame the topic. I've got a student right here in the front row. Well done, A+. And so I've got a little piece here that I'm going to kind of name and frame the issue. Then I'll introduce our panelists and then let them take it from there. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for some dialogue in between the panelists perhaps, and also with the audience, and we'll wrap up promptly at 5 p.m. So on March 8th, 2014, The Economist magazine published a story titled, "Big Batteries Threaten Big Power Stations and Utilities Profits." As a means to frame our dialogue on distributed generation, I'll share some highlights from the article. Who needs the power grid when you can generate and store your own electricity cheaply and reliably? Such a world is drawing nearer. Good news for consumers, but a potential shock for utility companies. That is the conclusion of a report this week by Morgan Stanley, this week being back in March, an investment bank which predicts that ever cheaper solar and other renewable energy sources combined with better and more plentiful batteries will allow many businesses and other electricity users to cut the cord on their electricity providers. Tesla Motors, an American maker of electric cars, and we have an owner of one here on the panel, recently said it will build a gigafactory, which by 2020 will turn out as many lithium-ion batteries as the whole world produced last year. These batteries can do more than power cars. They can also store electricity, which is produced when it is not needed, and discharge it when it is. So the factory's huge output of efficient batteries will boost the idea of distributed generation, producing electricity in small quantities near the point of use rather than in large amounts in a few places. In another indication that the idea's time has come, GE has set up a new business bringing together parts of its transport, aviation, and engines divisions to meet what it calls a $100 billion opportunity. Now it is possible to build small, cheap, and efficient plants that produce power in the tens of megawatts at most. A typical coal-fired power plant produces it in the hundreds. This not only cuts transmission costs, but reduces the risks of widespread power cuts and the economic damage that results. By far, the most disruptive new power source is solar panels. Morgan Stanley reckons that if Tesla's factory provides the cheap batteries it promises, Californian households will be able to run off a solar plus storage system costing just $350 a year. Buying electricity off the grid may cost them around $750 a year by then. America's Electric Power Research Institute last month produced a paper highlighting the dangers of an unplanned move to distributed generation, using Germany as an example. The dash for renewables there has strained the power network and made life hard for utilities. In America, two organizations more accustomed to scrapping with each other, the Edison Electric Institute, a trade body, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, a green group, have jointly urged regulators to revamp their rules, among other things, to encourage utilities to keep investing in upgrading the grid. That way, they say, both large and small-scale power producers will flourish in an age in which power flows in two directions. So hopefully we'll be discussing those topics and more in our panel. So our first panelist for the day is Barry Shear. President and CEO of Eagle Point Solar, Barry Shear is committed to the widespread implementation of solar power and the legislative policies that promote the growth of renewable energy systems. Barry founded Eagle Point Solar and built it into one of the larger solar developers in the state. Barry was a business turnaround specialist for 17 years, and prior to founding EPS, he was part owner and CEO of Help at Home Incorporated, a large home care provider with operations in 13 states and 140 operating units, providing over 13 million hours of care the last year of his ownership. I'll introduce the other panelists as they come up for their talks, so let's welcome Barry.
Thank you, Craig, and good afternoon, renewable energy stakeholders. Again, my name is Barry Shear, and I'm the owner of Eagle Point Solar in Dubuque. And I was invited to participate on this panel on DG, distributed generation, because in July of this year, I won a Supreme Court case which affirmed a district court decision which has had and will continue to have a profound impact on DG policies here in Iowa and elsewhere. The core dispute in this struggle between distributed solar, customer-owned distributed solar, and utilities is economic, because as you all know, the returns for solar come from tax subsidies and avoided utility cost. I don't think the utility universe is that concerned about tax subsidies, but they are certainly concerned about avoided utility cost. Any kilowatt that a customer owns is a permanent revenue loss for a utility. So they're going to have to factor that into their future business model. And there'll be a lot of talk about that on this panel. Solar is now a commercially viable technology for the production of both centralized and distributed electricity, and has been for a few years now. It hasn't been forever. It corresponds with the fall in solar prices. And I also believe I'm the only participant in this conference that at this point is planting solar in the state. That and defeating the Iowa utility universe in court on an issue that they really care about is why I'm talking to you right now. My main topic this afternoon pertains to third-party ownership, power purchase agreements, or PPAs in particular. Distributed generation flourishes when PPAs are allowed. This is demonstrated by the following statistics from SEIA, the Solar Energy Industry Association. In New Jersey, and this pertains to residential solar. In New Jersey, since the second quarter of 2013, 90% of the installed residential solar in New Jersey is third-party owned. In New York, a relatively newcomer to the massive proliferation of solar, in 2014, it's 50%. In Arizona, California, and Colorado, 69 to 81% of the residential installed solar was third-party owned. So why are these third-party structures so popular when they're allowed? Well, customers don't have to make a capital outlay. They just have to agree to pay for the energy that they're purchasing anyway, at or near grid power rates. So speaking for myself and the other solar developers, we have the opportunity now to do something that's good for the planet and make money doing it, and I'm not ashamed that that's my motivation as well. I don't believe there's ever going to be a time when policymakers think the air is too clean, the water is too pure, and we better inject more carbon into the atmosphere because the polar ice cap is overgrowing. But I'm also a pragmatist that if anybody believes that we're going to stop burning fossil fuels in our power plants, our vehicles, and everywhere else, they're just not being realistic either. So having said all that, clean energy must be a hard focus on all sides, even if it's costlier than conventional energy. Renewable energy is a stated policy priority in Iowa. In 1984, our current governor, in a different term, passed a 105 megawatt renewable portfolio standard. By today's standards, that's not even a rounding error. While I didn't live here then, people that did told me the utilities fought this RPS tooth and nail. So roll this forward 30 years to now. We have more than 5,000 megawatts of wind energy currently, and that number is growing every day. Something very similar can happen over time with solar. It is a very viable technology. I'm a big believer in big wind, but we need a balanced and diversified approach to our energy matrix. Wind is a huge economic driver in Iowa in terms of energy, avoided greenhouse gases, and jobs. In January 2014, this past January, the Iowa Utility Board initiated an inquiry into distributed generation. It's captioned DGNOI, Distributed Generation Notice of Inquiry, and it sought to elicit comments and opinions from all sides on the DG issue, not just the utility perspective. This NOI generated comments from more than 170 respondents, with the respondents essentially falling into two camps: the Iowa utility universe and everybody else, the rest of the world. So I commend IUB Chair Jacobs for initiating this process and including all stakeholders in this, because this is a very diverse issue, and there are a lot of constituencies that need input in on this. This DG NOI is a vital policy initiative by the IUB, and I don't have to say that I hope Chair Jacobs can give us some insight into this, because she told me she's going to. This has been through 2 substantial rounds of input from DG stakeholders, and there's another round of comments due in 8 days. So the whole world, not just Iowa, the whole world is watching the Iowa Utility Board with respect to the DG NOI. The issues surrounding DG solar are complicated and again are primarily economic in nature. It's load balancing issues, but the issues are primarily economic. The cost of solar installations has been on a significant downward trajectory, and that trend is expected to continue. The cost of grid power is on an upward trajectory, and that trend is expected to continue. Environmental restrictions for carbon emissions and essential upgrades to the nation's power grid will also continue that upward trajectory for grid power. The lines have now crossed. Solar is at virtual grid parity with utility rates, and in some cases, even cheaper than utility rates. In November 2012, I participated in a panel discussion right here at the University of Iowa, and the presenter before me was a German energy economist talking about how they did it in Germany. Okay. How do I get this to move? There. This chart was life-changing for me. This graph, and this is Germany. This graph shows a timeline from 1991 to 2012. The upper axis shows the growth of GDP per capita in this time span. The lower axis shows reduction in greenhouse gas per capita in the same time window. If this doesn't take your breath away, you're not paying attention. This isn't a theoretical discussion. This is a major industrial nation, Germany, and this is what happens with the right DG policies, and this can happen in the United States. It demonstrates that a major industrial nation, Germany, can increase GDP per capita while at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions per capita by widely implementing renewable technologies. Every being, entity, corporation, individual should have the right to self-generation a portion or all of their electricity from carbon-free and cost-free wind and sun. I think every individual corporation, school, municipality, and utility have a moral obligation to reduce their carbon footprint wherever, whenever, and however possible. So utilities and regulators are just going to have to adapt to the rapid evolution of DG because carbon pollution is here now and must be addressed now. And the utilities and the regulators are going to have to adjust their business model to accommodate that. I'm sure that ExxonMobil and BP Amoco don't particularly like fuel-efficient vehicles, and they must really not like electric cars because that represents a revenue loss. Carrying this to another extreme, perhaps grocery store chains don't like you growing your own vegetables because that's a revenue loss. So if we can grow our own food, why can't we grow our own clean energy? Now to the subject of power purchase agreements. A power purchase agreement, or PPA, is only a financial arrangement which allows non-taxable entities to make distributed renewable energy economically viable. Without the tax incentives, this technology is not viable. I waged this battle with the Iowa Utility Board and the utilities not because I want to own energy generation assets. I don't. I just want to build solar arrays. So the economic battle lines with the utilities are significant. We wish it wasn't so, but it is, and we know why. It's predictable. It's because of economics. So now let me give you a brief summary of the Supreme Court case. It all began with good intentions. On August 1st, 2011, the Dubuque City Council approved the first significant municipal solar project in the state. The project was sized to offset 35% of the building's electrical energy by producing 260,000 kilowatt hours a year. It was set up as a PPA so that we could monetize the tax attributes and make the project economically viable. The project at the time was the second largest solar array in the state, behind an array in Decorah, Iowa, and it was the first large solar project for my company. It was structured as these projects normally are, as a PPA. We filed our interconnection agreements with Alliant, obtained all the necessary approvals and permits, and began construction. On August 24th, I received a phone call from the city's economic development director, a rather panicked call, that Alliant had just advised the city that our project was illegal and must stop. My response was illegal, like a crime. Their position was that under Iowa law, this transaction, if allowed, would make me a public utility just like Alliant and Mid-America Energy. So think about that. There's now 3 public utilities, 2 multi-billion-dollar energy conglomerates, and my 12-person solar company in Dubuque, Iowa. Alliant stopped the project when we were about 65% complete and put the project in limbo. Alliant said they might permit a properly structured equipment lease, but not a PPA. The city manager and I both knew we had to get this partially completed project completed, so we took the economics of the PPA, rolled it into an equipment lease, and completed the project. But this development was really hard for me to swallow. First of all, every utility legal expert that I spoke with that didn't represent utilities said that Alliant's position was incorrect. I'm not a public utility. And I still had to find a legal remedy against a multi-billion-dollar energy conglomerate that had no interest in allowing PPAs. Alliant's position was that selling energy in any form to the public makes the seller a public utility. Since the city facility was a public facility, I was therefore selling energy to the public. Try and follow that logic. They would defend their rights to their exclusive service territory. My position was Alliant was incorrect. What was really happening here, and continues to this day, is the utilities were taking this position on PPAs because it was preventing the adoption of solar for the University of Iowa, the University of Dubuque, Iowa State, UNI, City of Iowa City, City of Dubuque, everywhere. Without PPAs and monetizing the third-party power, without monetizing the tax attributes, these projects simply aren't viable, and by not allowing these structures, they were simply preventing these projects from occurring. The dispute was going to be long, complicated, and costly. I recognized that at the time. There were no laws or regulations preventing PPAs, or for that matter, even mentioning them. My legal strategy was to seek a declaratory ruling from the Iowa Utility Board, a rarely used protocol to determine, based on a fact set, the fact set at hand, that Eagle Point Solar is not a public utility. It was a certainty that whether I won or lost, that one of the sides was going to take this further, and it was going to court. The IUB determined that under my fact set, I am indeed a public utility, subject to utility regulation, because I'm proposing to sell energy on a per kilowatt hour basis. Nowhere has this concept that selling energy on a per kilowatt basis makes you a public utility in law or statute or anywhere else that I'm aware of. So the battle lines were drawn. It's really pretty straightforward and predictable. There was the Iowa utility universe, which consisted of the IUB and all the utility constituencies in the state, but the investor-owned utilities, Alliant and Mid-American, did most of the heavy lifting. And then on my side was the Iowa Consumer Advocate. This was interesting because we had essentially two state agencies 180 degrees different on this issue, and a solar coalition which consisted of the largest environmental policy advocate organizations and solar industry associations on the planet. This IUB ruling was subsequently reversed by a district court judge in late 2013, and on July 14th, the Supreme Court affirmed that ruling. Eagle Point Solar is not a public utility, and we can now use PPAs as a financing mechanism for municipalities and non-taxables, or for that matter, taxable entities as well. What the Supreme Court ruling now means is that Eagle Point Solar and others can sell solar arrays at will. This court ruling has national implications for utilities, regulators, and solar advocates because the case was closely followed in at least 22 other states that have the same or similar regulatory environments. The case can't be pushed to the U.S. Supreme Court because it doesn't involve constitutional issues. So what I'm told by utility insiders that I know is they may try and pass a law in the legislature outlawing PPAs in the upcoming session. Well, Senator Bolcom's tax credit bill, which was tripled in 2014, passed the Senate 46-0 and passed the House 88-4, and I was standing to Governor Branstad's left when he signed the bill. I don't think that a bill to outlaw PPAs is going to happen. What's more likely to happen is the utilities are going to make solar less viable by recasting rate tariffs to be more demand-centric or capacity-based, based on the highest 15 minutes of use in a billing cycle. So while I don't have input in on that, perhaps I have general input in on that, it's up to the IUB and regulators to determine whether they're going to allow DG growth to prosper or stall based on arbitrarily changing the economics of rate tariffs. This is not sustainable. The DG stakes are high for all concerned: solar installers, developers, utilities, regulators, coal miners, railroads, and the planet. How it all shakes out is above my pay grade. All I know is that I'm going to invest the rest of my life to promoting this technology and trying to do something about climate change and renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Scott Blankman is the Director of Environmental Affairs and Energy Markets at Alliant Energy. He is responsible for environmental compliance of the generation and energy delivery operations and energy market trading, energy risk management, fossil fuel procurement, and support of customer-owned generation and energy market operation activities of the company. He facilitates the development of strategic planning in support of strategic initiatives. Scott, let's welcome him, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to spend some time with you today. I'll give you a little bit of history on Alliant Energy, a little bit of history on what we're seeing as far as customer-owned generation and how that's impacting our portfolio, and then also talk a little bit about the NOI that Barry mentioned before and that Libby will talk about as well. So who is Alliant Energy? We're a Midwest utility with operations in central and eastern Iowa, headquarters here in the Cedar Rapids area. We also have operations in southern Minnesota as well as in south central Wisconsin. We've got over $5 billion investment in the state of Iowa across the generation and distribution aspects of our business. When we look at our Iowa-specific profile, we've got about 500,000 customers, roughly 235,000 gas customers. And as MISO was talking about earlier today, we've got capacity that we own, and I'm speaking about just capacity that we own to meet our peak planning reserve margins that MISO was talking about earlier in the day. They mentioned having a 15% margin. We have to plan to be able to meet that peak delivery day, typically which happens in July or August based off of the heat. And we meet that with a combination of owned resources as well as purchase power agreements that provide capacity to be able to meet that obligation. And on our own capacity, about half of that is coal resources, primarily coal resources located along the Mississippi River as well as located throughout the state. We also have gas in our portfolio, we also have wind in our portfolio, and we also have peaking units as well that are part of meeting that peak delivery during that time period. We also have wind as part of our portfolio, as I mentioned. We've got owned wind as well as purchase power agreements that Barry has mentioned earlier that we also use to be able to meet our renewable portfolio standards. And those resources combined with a nuclear PPA that we have with the Duane Arnold Energy Center is how we meet our obligations for our peak delivery day. We also have to worry about meeting our energy needs over the course of the year, and we have about 16 million megawatt hours of energy that we deliver to the system. And that is essentially sold into the MISO market, bought from the MISO market, and I'll talk a little bit about what are the sources of that energy. And what we have in front of you is an illustration of how our portfolio has continued to evolve. In 2010, about half of our energy needs was met with coal generation, about 22% with the Duane Arnold Energy Center PPA that we have. We have market purchases, so these would be purchases that we would buy from the market based off of it was more economic to buy from the market than to run our own resources. We also have natural gas, which is largely our Emory generating station, and then we also have renewable energy, which is, as I mentioned before, a combination of owned wind, as Whispering Willow, as well as purchase power agreements. And that energy mix has continued to evolve over the last 3 years. We've seen our coal portfolio drop off to about 40%, and that's primarily related to a reduction in coal output driven by both economic reasons as well as driven by conscious decisions by the company to execute our strategic plan and reducing our carbon footprint. We have converted coal units to gas units at Dubuque and at Sutherland. We're also going to be continuing to do that with our ML Cap unit in Clinton. So those have reduced the coal output from those resources. We've also seen an increase in our renewable portfolio as we've had an increase in output from the Whispering Willow wind farm, which has seen some improvement following some transmission upgrades, as well as increased output from Emory, the natural gas resource. And that has largely been influenced by some economic issues surrounding lower gas prices as that's impacted that dispatch. We also have some things that were talked about today on the EPRI discussion that I think we can kind of connect here a bit for you. EPRI was talking about some of that behind the meter generation, and this kind of ties into what Barry was alluding to earlier with what's happening with interest in customer-owned generation. As you see from the chart, we were at about 7 megawatts of customer-owned generation in Iowa in 2009. And as we sit here today on the 1st of October, we had about 28 megawatts of customer-owned generation. And that that growth has primarily come in two forms. One in wind, as well as in photovoltaic solar here in the last couple of years. And that growth in the photovoltaic solar has largely been influenced by declining solar prices, which is what Barry has mentioned. You also have seen an interest or increase in incentives, with the federal tax credit and some of the rural credits that have been coming in, as well as a continued decline in the production costs associated with that. And from a personal perspective, I can say that, that drop in solar cost is one of the reasons why in February of this year, after initially looking at putting solar on my home in 2009, I pulled the trigger and put a 6 kilowatt system on my home in Madison, Wisconsin this past February. So it's happening. It's happening with our customers. We've done some customer research over the course of the summers. We've been talking with our board of directors as they see what's happening in this space. And we know that customers have interest in home-based generation. They're looking for an opportunity to control their bills, provide stability in their bill structure, also looking for greener, lower carbon solutions. And we're prepared to be able to meet that on a go-forward basis. Some of the things that we are looking at to be able to manage that, and kind of that transition within the utility business model is, as we've been responding to the notice of inquiry that Barry had mentioned that Libby will be addressing earlier, we've got a core set of principles that are really at the heart of what we're trying to do as the utility in support of that. First, I think break these down into a couple of things. One, we want to make sure that we're educating customers, with a partnership there. We also want to make sure that we've got reliability, which is one of the major things that was talked throughout the course of the discussion today, both from MISO on not wanting to have blackouts, as well as EPRI on maintaining that reliability that's important. Also, we want to make sure that we're receptive to what our customers' needs are. Also making sure that we're providing options to customers who maybe don't want to have solar on their home. Maybe they can't afford it, or their home is not positioned well to be able to have a suitable system on their location. So those could involve other options, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about those. But we also want to make sure that we've got consumer protections in place so customers are making informed decisions. We think we can help inform those decisions. And we also think that, as Barry has mentioned, as we continue to see an increase in, particularly on the solar side, an increase in that generation, that does have an impact on what our total energy needs are. And ultimately, that has an impact on the remaining customers who are continuing to take service. And that is one of those major elements that gets caught up in the net metering debate. So those are the guiding principles. So let me go back and talk a little bit about those from kind of starting from the top down. First off, we want to make sure that we're educating customers on what are their options so that they can go ahead and maximize the incentives that are available to them. And that means being able to partner and understand, what are your energy needs? What are you trying to accomplish? To make sure that you're sizing your system, in a manner that fits in to what your needs are and what your objectives are. We also need to maintain reliability, to the electric grid. We have an obligation to serve the grid and all of the customers that are there, including those that do not have, customer-owned generation. We also need to make sure that if our utility employees are going to the site, that they can, operate on the system and not have to be worrying from a safety perspective. So that gets back into some of the interconnection issues that are a key element of the notice of inquiry that we're working with the IUB and the other interested parties. The other thing is we also realize that not all customers can go ahead and afford home-based generation, or they may not want to own that. So consequently, we need to look at, are there other options that are available to them with green pricing programs, which provides more flexibility to customers, as well as, we know there's interest in community solar, and that would be a way to be able to provide, perhaps more customers, access to solar, perhaps in a community type environment that also has some economies of scales associated with it. And that we'll get into some of that probably in some of the Q&A, but those are some of the benefits that come with the utility model, is that you can go ahead and plan where would a community solar project potentially make sense so that you can optimize that grid, again tying back into the EPRI discussion from earlier this afternoon. And then, the last bullet there, this is the issue that the most of the industry is talking about with regards to pricing, and Barry has alluded to it. As you lose demand and you still have customers on the system, a lot of talk has been going on about, is this a rich, cost that is being passed down to the less fortunate or to the poor? And what we are trying to find is what's the appropriate balance there and being able to look at that. And that's one of the major components that we're looking at in the net metering, component of the notice of inquiry on how do you establish rates. And there's been a lot of things that have been coming out with regards to that, particularly after seeing, what's been happening in Hawaii, what's been happening in the Southwest and California and Arizona, et cetera, as everyone's wrestling with a legacy utility model that's taking a look at, a charging of customers on a per kilowatt hour basis. And as Barry mentioned in his opening remarks, looking at what does that potentially look like if you have a demand component with that. So I don't think that that's an issue that's unique to Alliant. It's not unique to Iowa. It's really a nationwide issue. And obviously everyone's looking for what's the best possible solution to be able to move forward. So in closing, look forward to answering any questions that we have on a go-forward basis. And I think one of the things that I'll close with is, in order for the grid to continue to be successful, I really believe that there needs to be collaboration across all the spectrums with all of the key stakeholders, Barry, with the IUB, the regulators, environmental groups, everyone who has an interest in this. There needs to be collaboration on how we best move forward, and I think we can do that. We're just going to take a little bit of time and understanding and finding what that common ground is and how do we build from there. So, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Libby Jacobs began serving on the Iowa Utilities Board on May 1st, 2011. Jacobs is a National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners member, and that's got an acronym, NARUC, it's going to come up, and has been appointed to serve as co-vice chair of the NARUC's Committee on Electricity, and is a member of the Subcommittee on Nuclear Issues Waste Disposal and the Task Force on Environmental Regulation and Generation. Jacobs serves as the vice president of the Organization of MISO States. MISO, I know not everyone in here knows what that is, Mid-Continent Independent System Operator Incorporated, and is a member of the OMS Executive Committee and is a member of the MISO Advisory Committee. She is a voting member on the Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council. Please help me welcome Libby.
Great, thank you, Craig, and thanks everyone for your interest this afternoon. That's called NARUC for short, much easier. NARUC. So, but yeah, acronyms are alive and well in the energy world, as we all know. First of all, just a little bit about the Iowa Utilities Board. We are an independent, quasi-judicial agency in state government, independent in that no one can tell us what to do or not to do. So as we look at cases, because we do serve in that quasi-judicial role, we're at arm's length away from a lot of the other entities within the state, which gives us a little bit of a unique perspective. We also are the only entity in the state that is charged with what I continue to call the three-legged stool of responsibility. We are responsible for making sure there's reliability for the customers in Iowa of the electric system, that consumers are protected and considered in all matters that come before us, and that's consumers at the residential, commercial, and industrial level, and that we do consider the financial viability of the industry. We don't want to have industries going bankrupt or companies going bankrupt and not having the lights go on. So that's who we are. There's a picture of our building on the slide that we've been in there now a little over 3 years, coming on to 4. We are a LEED Platinum certified building. We've won all sorts of international and national awards. We have, our footprint is about 44,000 square feet, and we use 70% less energy than comparable buildings of that size. We have a solar array on top, and in the last 2 years, that's provided in the summers about 25% of our energy for the building. So we do try to walk the talk at times. I think just to give you a little bit more of kind of a context of who we are, the energy utilities in the state, obviously everybody's familiar with Alliant, operating as IPL, and Mid-American in the state. There also are 136 municipal electric utilities, which we regulate for safety and disconnection. The large investor-owned utilities, we regulate for those rates and service as well. There are also 45 rural electric cooperatives in the state that one has chosen to be rate regulated by us. All of the others are regulated on service, safety, and disconnection. There are 5 investor-owned utilities that provide natural gas services in the state, and there are 51 municipal gas utilities, which once again we do not have any purview over except for safety and disconnection. I think as we tee up a conversation on distributed generation, we first need to take a step back and do a little broader conversation just on renewable energy in general. And I tried to focus more on the policy side of things, since this is partly sponsored by the Public Policy Center. We appreciate that. Just some things that I think everybody in the room probably knows, that Iowa was one of the early actors in terms of adopting policies to encourage renewable energy. In 1983, as was mentioned earlier, we had the Alternative Energy Production Law. That's what the closest thing we have to an RPS, the 105 megawatts. I keep saying it goes back to the state motto of our liberties we prize and our rights we will maintain. Somehow we just don't need mandates. We seem to get things done fairly well on our own without all of that. So for whatever reason, the 105 megawatts has stayed there. As was noted earlier, I think it was Barry who indicated we're at 5,000 megawatts. When the Mid-American Wind 8 farm comes on next year, we'll be at 6,100. And I assume all of you saw the announcement by Mid-American Energy just recently that they are filing with us and have filed with us a request to expand for additional wind of somewhere about 160, 164 megawatts. So the law seems to continue to work. We also have advanced rate-making principles, which go out for renewable energy as well as for more of the traditional forms of generating facilities. That was fairly unique at the time. Other states have started to adopt that, but it allows for jurisdictional allocation, accounting for environmental credits, wholesale revenues, depreciation, ROEs, cancellation, cost recovery. That's all determined up front before the construction begins. We also have the Renewable Electric Generation Law that specifically states that the state's intent is to encourage the development of renewable electric power generation, to encourage the use of renewable power to meet local electric needs and develop transmission capacity to export Iowa-generated wind power. And then obviously we have rules for interconnection of distributed generation, which allows for some expedited review and different kinds of review based on the size of the facility. This is not an eye chart for those of you in the back of the room, but just other laws that are out there designated to encourage development of alternative or renewable energy. Iowa has really been at the forefront in a lot of those, and I think that has served us well. And obviously, as we look where we are right now in terms of overall renewables, it's been very positive for the consumers, for the industry, for the reliability factor, as well as for economic development within the state. The results, just Iowa's energy mix, the numbers come from EIA. We still are fairly heavy in coal, although that number keeps declining every year. And the newest EIA figures have wind up to over 27%. Then we've got natural gas, and we do have the one nuclear plant. And the natural gas does continue to grow. The results, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this, but as you know, we're #1 in the nation for percentage of electricity generated by wind energy. We rank #2 in total wind generation. I talked about the installed wind capacity. The number of wind turbines is over 3,200, and we rank 3rd in the country for the number of utility-scale wind turbines. Wind projects online, 101 wind projects, and wind capacity under construction. I just mentioned the mid-am of over 1,000 megawatts. That all came from the American Wind Energy Association. A lot of that's also from the Energy Information Association of the federal government. When we talk about DG, we also need to remember that it's more than just wind and solar. While those two contribute a lot to it, there are other renewables out there. We do have some hydro in the state. There are biomass and waste. There's ethanol, and there's biodiesel. We also have to think that as we talk about distributed generation, it's combined heat and power. It's also those diesel generators that stand as backups in a lot of manufacturing facilities, or actually on the state capitol complex in Des Moines. We have the generators to back up if the system goes down. Enough of the history. I'll switch to the NOI on distributed generation. The two previous speakers have mentioned that. The notice of inquiry was announced early in January of 2014. It grew out of a variety of factors. Our energy efficiency plan proceedings. I think most of you know that Iowa requires the major IOUs to have energy efficiency plans that are reviewed and introduced to us every 5 years. One of the reasons we went with the NOI was it made sense for the regulators in the state to be the convener and facilitator for conversation regarding public policy and a picture at a larger scale of what's the vision for distributed generation in the state of Iowa. There were a lot of piecemeal approaches that could be done. Obviously, for the legislators in the room, policy could be set that way. Individual utilities could be doing things that they wanted to do. We could be doing things from a rulemaking standpoint. But it seemed to us to make the most sense to bring everybody together in the room and talk about distributed generation and what the vision is for Iowa and what's needed from a public policy standpoint, from a utility standpoint, from environmental, you name it, all the different aspects of it. What we really tried to do was cast a broad net. I actually reached out to as many of the national associations. EPRI was here earlier, reached out to Environmental Defense Fund, all the different groups, asking them to participate. What I was really looking for from them was data. A lot of them have done national studies. We'd like to have some of that in our record as we look at distributed generation so that we can kind of get some facts that are out there that are more on a national basis. But we also reached out to not only all the different utility groups and the environmental groups, we reached out to entities such as the Iowa League of Cities and the Iowa Association of Counties, because those folks have to make a lot of the localized decisions, and they haven't always been involved in the conversation. So really cast a very large and broad net, wanting everybody we could humanly get to at least think about sitting at the table or hopefully filing comments and being really engaged with the process. We did settle in on a working definition of what distributed generation is. That alone is a major task because it means so many things to different people. Our definition, as noted on the slide, is that it's generation fueled by renewable or fossil fuel sources built in order to serve load located at or near the generator and capable of delivering power to a utilities distribution system. And was noted earlier, so far we've had two rounds of comments presented to us. The first round of inquiry was very general, intended to really identify what are those things that we really kind of needed to hone into. So think of it more of a funnel approach. Cast this broad net and then start trying to hone in on those things that we think really at the end are what we need to focus on. Looked at the benefits and challenges of DG for utilities and ratepayers, whether they differ for utility-owned DG versus customer-owned DG. What policies, as I noted, should be examined in connection with it, and what other topics should be out there that we should examine from a technological, a financial, a regulatory, a safety standpoint. As was noted earlier, we received comments from over 170 diverse respondents, and the comments covered a wide range of topics. Everything from letters that basically just said in one paragraph, "We love distributed generation, thank you very much," to something with massive amounts of documentation attached to it, and then everything in between. A lot of conversation on net metering, on interconnection, on safety and reliability, on the financial issues, feed-in tariffs, incentives, permitting, consumer protection, utility planning. It really ran the gamut. So then we took from that and went to that funnel approach with the second round of inquiry, and it was much more focused. And what we really focused on were net metering. We did exclude avoided costs and standby rates because that's being considered in a separate notice of inquiry. We focused on interconnection to include safety and reliability, and customer awareness and protection. Once again, going back to that statutory requirement that we are to look out for consumers, and we want to make sure that was covered. From 170 comments the first round, we went down to 47 different parties filing comments in the second round. Last month, we issued a follow-up order that encourages the municipal utilities and the electric cooperatives to offer net metering and to follow the board's interconnection standards. This was all based on comments that were filed in the first two rounds. We chose to table the discussion of feed-in tariffs. That did not seem to be as high of a topic of interest as others. We also agreed that the state fire marshal is the entity that should determine whether additional measures are needed to ensure that DG does not jeopardize the safety of fire personnel. That is a big issue, and that's one we hear around the country. We felt that that certainly was out of our purview, but we didn't want to totally lose sight of that. We also agreed that the state fire marshal really is the one who should determine whether a distributed generation installer should be licensed or certified. And we stated that the Iowa Attorney General's office is the appropriate authority to address the DG-related customer complaints unless it's related to the utility, tariff, or interconnection issues, which once again we are the statutory agent for. Also in that order, we scheduled a workshop that will occur next week to discuss a draft of a distributed generation checklist. Our hope is that that checklist will be useful to all parties, but particularly consumers who are beginning to think about what they would like to do in terms of distributed generation. At this point, we don't anticipate mandates that the checklist has to be used, but we'd hope that once this checklist is developed and the draft was attached to the order, that a final checklist would be out there for entities all over the state to be able to publicize. Whether we'll certainly have it on our website, we would hope that all the different utilities would utilize it, the Iowa Energy Center, the environmental groups, the cities, the counties, you name it. We would hope that that becomes some sort of common frame of reference for consumers as they begin to think about distributed generation. That board order we issued last month also allows participants to file reply comments and responses to additional questions. If you've seen it, I do have a copy of the order with me, and there are pages and pages of additional questions we're asking. This is not something of an issue that can easily be just figured out in one or two quick settings. And we also asked for comment on the impact of the Eagle Point solar decision in Iowa. What does this mean going forward? What are the implications for net metering and interconnection rules? The next steps, as I indicated, we will develop a web page. We are actually retooling our entire website. The new one will roll out the first week of December, hopefully, if all of the background works goes as planned. But not only will we have the checklist, we will have interconnection rules and forms, utility industry information. We hope to link to all sorts of different websites to help consumers and anyone with questions on distributed generation know where to go. We'd really like to see this as really kind of your first point of contact in trying to figure out and trying to make that whole maze a lot simpler. The board will review all those comments that are due to us within about the next week. And if needed, we then anticipate holding some sort of workshop that could talk about net metering or interconnection in further detail. And finally, there will be a report that will relate to those various issues that will be released once all the comments have been put together. We anticipate that there could be other questions that are still out there on cost shifting. How do you value DG? How utilities may change their business models to accommodate distributed generation? How do you integrate distributed generation into utility resource planning? what types of distributed generation are likely to become most prevalent, and of course there's always something new out there that we haven't even identified yet. That's it. I look forward to the conversation and your interest in distributed generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Libby. Scott Spak is an assistant professor right here at the University of Iowa, holding joint appointments with urban and regional planning, civil and environmental engineering, and the environmental policy program at the Public Policy Center. He teaches courses on U.S. and international environmental policy, dynamic systems modeling, and urban growth. Spak develops and applies numerical models to study the intersection between human activities and environmental change. Please help me welcome Scott.
I've been looking to answer the question, who has access to distributed energy generation, especially in Iowa cities? How do we expand that access? And at what levels and what policies can we apply to get to the level of market penetration that our earlier speakers, like Mark Jacobson, thinks that we need in order to meet our energy challenges? And first, I wanted to look at reasons for distributed generation that we haven't yet talked about today, which is a very large set of reasons that can appeal to everyone beyond the fear basis of greenhouse gas emissions and energy security, and more toward our own incentives for wanting distributed generation. The reason that Germany has so heavily subsidized residential distributed generation over utility scale is that a belief in an ownership society, that owning the means of production for energy is an important thing, just like owning your own home. And so their subsidies for residential solar are about 1.5 times higher than their subsidies for utility-owned solar. And that's played a major role in the success and also the challenges and costs of how they've done things. And we need to learn from those first attempts at incentivizing distributed if we want to do so in a way that doesn't lead us to follow Germany, which has the highest energy prices in all of Europe. Right now, distributed generation is a safe micro-capital investment. If you have 10 grand and you don't want to risk it in a toppy stock market, where else can you earn a reliable 5, 6, 7% return, which with current initial tax subsidies or distributed power purchasing, you can get. Renewables in small quantities, up to about 30%, can improve power quality. And there's been about 40 different publications in the past year and a half looking at empirically what happens when you add distributed solar and wind into municipal energy systems, and how does it change power quality. And I assume most of the funding agencies thought that this might be a challenge. It's actually improved power quality in every instance, in developing countries and in the US. It, of course, leads to more resilient communities when there are power outages. If you have some local generation, you can get that going. It helps build a new, stable private sector enterprise in installing, maintaining, and expanding this capacity. And if you want to avoid costly regulation and you don't want government interfering in energy generation, then you have to get out ahead of that. And finally, distributed generation is a productive use of residential areas. And so we have built out in this country over the past 50 or so years a lot of unproductive suburbia. It generates a lot of tax receipts, but it's depreciating assets, and it's only our population Ponzi scheme and the benefits of location that cause housing prices to rise. Well, what about a future in which our technological needs and wants expand, in which every garage or barn has its own 3D printer, its own genetic engineering capacity for making new stuff? Being able to power that yourself is a part of that renewal of the yeoman farmer dream. And turning suburbia and turning our residential areas in places that can be productive as well as consumptive areas, is philosophically important in terms of how we build out our cities in the future. There are lots of good reasons to act now, and probably the best is that this is the time, according to people from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and top hits from the early 2000s, of when we should be putting in distributed generation. It's while the combustible stuff is still cheap. And it's before we build out the rest of the globe the way we have the US. And so as you can see here, carbon dioxide projected emissions under many different Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change their scenarios, high, middle, or low, are all reliant on future infrastructure that hasn't been built yet. The consumptive infrastructure hasn't been built yet. Those are mobile phones with new technologies that don't exist yet. And the production, the energy production, doesn't exist yet. And that's the same in the US and in all of the developing world as well. But does urban generation capacity in practice match those top-down estimates? If we need solar on every roof, will it really deliver what we expect? And so whether it's capacity or right sizing for household demand or return on investment or equity in who has access or the zoning and permitting required to actually get those installed, and then the installation capacity. If policymakers say we need to turn on a dime and start doing this, can we do it? Are there enough Barry Shears out there that are able to meet all of the needs of a world looking to make that transition, whether it's for security reasons, whether it's for moral reasons, or whether it's because regulators require it? And I worked with a group of students as part of the Iowa Initiative for Sustainable Communities in Dubuque, looking at how those realities match up to our top-down expectations and our hopes for what distributed energy generation can do. And we worked with Greater Dubuque Development Corporation to estimate renewable energy capacity for every parcel in the city and to see what the economic and geophysical realities for energy generation really are at the urban scale in a typical Iowa city. And for solar, Dubuque has around 800 people per square kilometer. It's not particularly dense. And this is an assessment of incoming solar radiation. And you can see that in downtown Dubuque, there's great variation. And even Dubuque's density impacts the solar resource. If you're shaded by a building, you're going to have less energy. If you're shaded by a tree, you're going to have less generation capacity. And even on one rooftop, there's great difference in the available capacity. We did the same thing with looking at wind using open wind and open source wind farm software, modeling software, and we found great variability in urban scale wind resource as well for commercial and residential parcels. Almost a factor of 3 difference, in fact, just within the city. And this is not included in most renewable energy or climate plans that cities make. They assume we have this one number that comes from Iowa Energy Center or from National Weather Service. That's the average for our city. That average for your city may not apply to the places where you actually want to put new generation capacity. And for ground source heat pump, not necessarily generation, but more of a way to offset generation costs for heating for natural gas. There's a big dependence on land use history, where if you're in an urban area near a leaking underground storage tank, you can't drill for ground source heat pump. And if you have a small parcel, you might not be able to fit all of the coils needed to have that be a viable way to offset your heating, which is a big part of our total energy consumption. The return on investment, after we looked at Dubuque, which at the time had no power purchasing agreement, and so this is just based on federal and state tax credits, there's great variability between parcels in commercial buildings and in residential buildings on whether solar photovoltaic makes sense. And many parcels, if they have access to the south, to a south-facing exposure, and sufficient size, will have a return on investment of 5 to 6%, but many won't. And in fact, if you're shaded by a bluff or shaded by large buildings, so the return on investment can be as low as, well, about a third of the parcels in Dubuque were below 0.5 ROI. For solar hot water, despite the glut of natural gas and low natural gas prices, there are lots of places where solar hot water makes sense in levels designed to meet household needs. It's another distributed generation capacity, not for electricity, not competing in the same way as a provider in the way that electricity does. And small commercial wind, while generally not viable across most urban areas and across much of the city, there are places where it does make sense. And so we do need these analytics, which we currently don't have. There are a few small commercial providers who for $20 or $25 will tell you about what your parcel can do, but we don't have national scale analytics of this level to support decisions rationally about where to put distributed generation and how much it can contribute realistically to our energy mix. Our policies are, if you want to buy it, we'll subsidize it. But we're not thinking through the planning process of how to encourage putting these installations where they make sense. And one of the places where they make sense most is in public buildings. So Dubuque's police station, we looked at how much of their demand could be met on site by generation, and of course they're near a gas station with a retired leaking underground storage tank, so they can't do ground source heat pump. And that's unfortunate because most of their demand is for heating, their net energy demand. But for solar PV and solar thermal, they'll be able to meet 100% of their demand on site. And most public buildings in Iowa of a similar size have probably the same capacity. They would have a return on investment for solar thermal in the range of 18 to 31%. And again, most police stations and public buildings with this type of energy consumption mix would gain from and gain quickly with a quick payback period on solar hot water as part of, not all of, their hot water needs. Urban generation capacity, urban electricity demand, and urban capital are decoupled. The ability to invest, the need, and the geophysical flow are not the same. They're not in the same places. Often, as in Dubuque, the wealthiest census tracts, here shown with the size of the circles, tend to be in places where they have small parcels and lower incoming solar radiation. The poorest census tracts tend to have somewhere in between in terms of capacity, but very low capital to be able to make the upfront investment in distributed generation. And those large suburban parcels are somewhere in between. High demand, middling ability to pay the upfront costs, lots of potential. And so this means that the decision to put distributed generation in as a community scale can't necessarily be done neighborhood by neighborhood and is more of a full community level question and a community planning question. And much of the community planning support that's been provided by the federal government to date by the Sunshot program and other Department of Energy programs has been at removing barriers, lowering permitting costs and time, removing barriers to solar rather than policies that support solar. And we have lots of policies that support solar, and they're usually very old. So Spanish cities were built on a 45-degree angle to maintain those solar envelopes so that every parcel has access to south-facing sun for daylighting and, well, it turns out, for generation as well. And buildings in England in the 1800s, same thing. We have a long history of trying to do this. And Barcelona is at about the same latitude as Iowa City, about 41 degrees. And they applied that, and they're built on that 45-degree grid, and who wouldn't want to visit Barcelona? So the things that enable solar access and distributed generation and that support building out this type of capacity also make for neat cities. So what should we do? Part of this is to decide at the community scale, locally and globally, whether or not state or federal regulators want to tell us what to do. To implement local policies that are actually supportive of solar and from which we have a long history of simple things that we can do, like enshrining right to south-facing sun, and if there is a new building that gets in the way, you have to be compensated for your loss of ability to generate. We don't have that yet, and so it's a great risk if you're in an area that's densifying to put on solar, because it's tough to sell 20, 30-year-old panels halfway through their lifespan. There's an immediate need for national urban scale analytics, and in the next 10 years, looking at different private, nonprofit, and community-owned ways to finance power and power purchasing that enable a realistic and less subsidized expansion of this distributed generation. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. And again, my thanks to all the panelists. We are 2 minutes to 5. So we have time for a couple questions. And so if there's a microphone floating around and if you've got a question out there, please ask. I see an eager question asker already.
Great range of talks. I love the juxtaposition of the dragging the utility, kicking and screaming to facilitate distributed generation, and the utilities doing a jolly good job of assisting that process, and all the other colourful contributions. Lots of questions. I'll save just my favourite question to Scott.
Which one, just to be clear?
Sorry, Scott Blankman. I beg your pardon. So I noticed in the last 3 years, Alliant's coal portfolio has gone down 10%, from 50 to 40 roughly, which is a great achievement. Given the juxtaposition of your talk to James Henson's talk just before the break, and he was saying, we've got to get rid of coal completely, what is your company's target date to get rid of coal completely?
As we look at our long-term resource plans, we will likely still have coal in our portfolio, particularly as we're looking at kind of the evolution of the Clean Power Plan. One of the things that we're looking at is our portfolio has continued to evolve, and we've done the following. We have looked at our largest, most efficient units, which are competitive in the MISO market, and we've made performance improvement efforts and projects at those units to continue to make them competitive. We've also been looking at installing air quality control systems to be able to control NOx and SO2 and particulate matter and mercury. So when we look at our portfolio, let's take, for example, the ones that we own and operate, Atumwa and Lansing Unit Number 4. Those are in our long-term strategic plan through, let's say, 2030, 2035 kind of time period. When you look at the other smaller, less efficient units in our portfolio, those units we would expect to retire probably based off of our resource plan that we filed in Minnesota in that middle of the 2025 decade. Some of those potentially could be going to natural gas, during that next 10-year time horizon as we look at those as potential options. Pardon? Well, I think it's too hard to say at this point in time that when exactly we will be at zero coal. What we have been saying is our strategic plan is moving us off fossil fuels with less reliance on coal, still having gas in the portfolio and increasing our reliance on wind and other activities.
Another question? I think we got one here.
This is for Libby, and it's indirectly related. The Iowa Utilities Board has to have a hearing, I understand, on the proposed Bakken pipeline. Any idea when that hearing is going to be or how that process is going to work?
There's a very defined process for pipeline and transmission siting, as well as other generation siting as well. The process for the Bakken, first of all, we haven't been asked to site a hazardous liquids pipeline in well over 10 years. So this is something a little different as well, but it still follows the same process. Before the developer of the project, in this case that's Energy Transfer Partners, files with us, informational meetings must be held in every county where the pipeline will potentially be constructed. I think that's 18 counties at this point. It's a diagonal through the state. So we have been working with Energy Transfer Partners to get those meetings set up. They really are responsible for setting those up. They were originally going to start doing some of those this month, but I think they talked with Farm Bureau, and Farm Bureau said, you know, farmers are in the middle of harvest season, they're going to be most impacted. That's not going to work. So now they're looking at the Energy Transfer Partners is looking at the first 2 weeks of December to host these throughout the state. Those informational meetings are not formal public comment meetings. They are the opportunity for the company to, for anybody in the public to attend, and for the company to present the details of its project, for our safety and engineering staff to walk through the process of what's involved, specifically focusing on landowner rights and the issues of eminent domain and how that is all handled. But the company is forbidden from negotiating any easements or landowner compensation until those meetings have been held. We do not have responsibility for the compensation. That is done at the local county compensation board. So that is something that is not in our purview. So once those public comment, or excuse me, those informational meetings are held, then the developer most likely would file its case with the IUB. What we're hearing through the news media primarily is that that will be somewhere in the first part of 2015. Then anyone can, make a filing that they want to be an intervener, to make comments. Statutorily, we are required to host a public comment hearing that the board puts on in the midway point of that pipeline. So we have to measure and figure out what county is in the midway point, and have a public comment hearing at that time. The interesting thing with this pipeline is because it's really under federal jurisdiction, we are tasked with looking at siting from, is it in the public interest? We are not allowed to consider the safety factor of that pipeline. That is up to PHMSA, which is the Federal Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. We've been talking to the folks at PHMSA, asking if they would come out and attend the informational meetings, and if they are thinking about doing any sort of upfront design review. They're going to get back to us on that, is the polite way of saying it. Typically what happens is that they don't even start to inspect until the construction is underway. So we can't talk about safety. We can't factor that into any of our decisions at all. That is all up to PHMSA. So we're trying to get the word out on that as fast as we can to let people understand what's under our purview and what's under the feds. So long-winded answer, but I wanted to know you to know that there is a process all the way through. We're also the only entity that will be that is granted the ability to determine if eminent domain may be used or not. So we will have to weigh that scenario in our decision as well. Hopefully that answers your question. It probably gives you way more than you expected.
No comments are to be made?
Yeah, typically it's more of a question and answer between the developers and finding out from us what the landowner rights are. Obviously, some of those questions can turn into comments, but that is not, since there's no open docket at that point, those comments wouldn't be part of the record, they wouldn't, so that's why it's really more of an information type of thing. If people are upset, we understand that, and I'm sure comments will spill over, but it's not the formal comment gathering process in an open docket.
I see a few more questions, and I think they're targeted on a very specific topic, and I know our panelists will be here afterwards. Pete Damiano has some closing words for us, and then as he comes up, let's thank our panelists one more time. Thank you.
I just want to thank you all on behalf of the Public Policy Center and all of our co-sponsors for this event for your interest and willingness to be a part of this civil discourse around the evidence base that we have, be able to challenge each other, but in a way that's constructive, and be able to hopefully everyone come out of here a little bit better informed and be able to better move forward on these things that if they were easy answers, we wouldn't have to be here. Please join me in thanking Leslie Gannon and the rest of the staff of the Public Policy Center for all their work putting this all together.